for our last lecture, I think we're going to do something significantly less structured than we've done for the other ones. Um, you'll notice you don't even have a lecture outline for this one. So one of the things that we're going to do is, instead of take you through everything that's happening in the 21st century, your book actually covers a lot of that stuff really well. We're going to use your book, chapter 10 in your book, as kind of your outline to go by. And in the lecture, I'm just going to pick out a handful of things to give you a little more detail on. Many of them are issues that have antecedents obviously very far into the past. Some of them are things that have cropped up very recently in response to global events and global trends. So that's what we're going to start with first. Something really kind of new, as in the last 19 years, something that's become an issue. And that is the way that the war on terrorism is affecting Native communities. Travel issues, law and order issues, all of those things. To an extent, this does have some historical antecedents. But really what is affecting Native people in the 21st century is the restriction of cross-border movement in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, especially for those tribes that are along the borders, or those tribes whose reservations actually cross the border. The passport restrictions that the government created following 9/11, that kind of flew in the face of, for northern tribes at least, a treaty that goes back to 1794. That's the Jay Treaty, and it allowed for free intra-tribal movement to traditional tribal lands between the United States and Canada. And then later on, after the U.S. war with Mexico in the 1840s, those movement rights were extended to tribes on the southern border as well. And the same year that the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, Congress specifically exempted American Indians born in Canada from the dictates of various immigration laws. But tribal border issues, the ability to move within your own reservation or to travel from your reservation in the United States to traditional lands in Canada or Mexico, have really been damaged by these recent border restrictions. The largest of these cross-border tribal areas belongs to the Tohono O'odham. They've got a 3 million acre reservation that lies between southern Arizona and northern Sonora. And they have difficulty getting from the northern end of their reservation to the southern end of their same reservation because a national border crosses it, and since 9/11, that's become an issue. Following the terrorist attacks, the federal government created the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. Did you know the Department of Homeland Security was that young? It's younger than, I think, all of you. Part of the mandate of Homeland Security was oversight over Customs and Border Enforcement and immigration. And one of the major outcomes of the new border security measures was this program called the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. That was enacted in 2009. And it was intended to, on the one hand, improve international border security, but at the same time, facilitate the smooth flow of trade. So after that program was established, approved trade groups have access to very quick border entry. But everyone who's outside of that, including Native Americans, are required to present a valid passport. So like I remember when I was a kid, you could go to Mexico and Canada and not ever take it. You didn't need a passport. You could just get through with a driver's license, and half the time they didn't even check that. But now you've got to have a passport. And the problem that that causes for Native people is um, border enforcement does not recognize tribal IDs as valid documents. And that poses a serious dilemma in that many indigenous people in the US and also indigenous people in Canada and Mexico who ought to, by the provisions of the Jay Treaty, be able to travel into the United States to their traditional lands, they often don't have the required documents. They often don't have an official birth certificate or voter registration, and they certainly don't have social security cards if they're from Canada and Mexico. And in the United States, even some of our people don't. And because of that, indigenous people, especially members of those tribal groups whose traditional lands cross the US-Mexico border or the US-Canada border, are among the people most affected by this increase in security theater. Now, since 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the federal government has further intruded into tribal governance within Indian country with a current situation that allows the US military to enter and occupy tribal lands unilaterally, which means they don't have to ask the tribe if it's okay to put US troops in their territory. Essentially, the US government has served notice to Indian tribes that it can intervene in tribal country just whenever it wants to, under the authority of the Department of Homeland Security, including using military intervention with no legal recourse from the tribes. Another way that the federal government has been interfering with tribal governance and tribal control of land is with issues that you may have heard about, actually, recent issues over the National Park Service and national monuments. A major current issue is President Trump's executive action overturning many of President Obama's declaration of national monuments, most notably those that were designed to protect indigenous sacred sites, like the Bears Ear National Monument. President Trump reduced Bears Ear National Monument in 2017, reduced it by about 85%, and opened up a substantial region to oil and mineral leasing on lands that are sacred to the Navajo, the Ute, and the Zuni Pueblo. And that didn't just disturb those tribes, it made all of the tribes very worried that these actions will also undermine things like NAGPRA, which we talked about in Lecture 9, or the Antiquities Act, that were designed to prevent the looting and vandalism and exploitation of sacred native sites. In addition to that, you've got President Trump's approval of the controversial Keystone XL pipeline. That's an international issue, not just because it affects indigenous tribes, but also because it involves the flow of Canadian oil sand to refineries down in the Texas Gulf. Tribal groups have opposed that pipeline route since it was first proposed, because it passes sacred sites and may cause damage, and second, because these pipelines leak. There is not a single pipeline in the United States or Canada that has been in operation for more than a month that has not leaked. Their arguments were mostly dismissed by the US government despite very large-scale protests. In March of 2017, President Trump issued a federal permit allowing the pipeline to proceed. Now, earlier this month, in July 6th of 2020, the Supreme Court ordered all current Keystone XL work be halted. But that order doesn't affect future construction. We've also had recent issues in Indian gaming, in casinos and bingo halls and that kind of thing. One of the most significant Indian gaming controversies involved um, to an extent, the second President Bush's administration, people who were involved in his administration. And the really key players in this scheme included Tom DeLay, who was a former congressional leader, and a couple of his operatives, Mike Scanlon and Jack Abramoff. And together, these three dudes were instrumental in swindling close to $80 million from Indian tribes in exchange for promising them help navigating the Bush administration to get gaming contracts. And that scheme was uncovered by Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who was the only indigenous person in the Senate at the time. He exposed that scheme while he was the chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, started investigating it back in 2004. And the investigation revealed that DeLay's operatives were being paid tens of millions of dollars to kind of run these like shakedown operations. They worked with allies in the state of Texas to get the state of Texas to close tribally owned casinos. There was the Tiguas Pueblo tribe got hit really hard by this. They had a casino in El Paso, and the state of Texas forced them to close it. And then Abramoff and Scanlon went to the Tiguas Pueblos and said, hey, we can help you. Pay us like $4.5 million, and we'll put in a good word for you with the state of Texas. We'll get them to reopen it for you. But they were the guys who had gotten the state of Texas to shut it down in the first place. So you get them to shut it down, get the state to shut it down, and then you get the tribe to pay you money, so you go tell your friends, hey, let them open it back up again. They funneled money to some of their personal accounts definitely, but also some of their like personal foundations, and like Abramoff was running a school in Washington, D.C., and so he approached the Tiguas with this scheme that would have benefited that school, where the school would be allowed to buy up life insurance on elderly tribal members, with the academy named as the beneficiaries of that life insurance. So in effect, it was like putting a price on the heads of tribal elders. And if the tribe didn't agree to it, then Scanlon and DeLay and Abramoff were not going to help them get their casino reopened. So yeah, that was pretty explosive when it came out, and actually pretty entertaining committee transcripts from these guys' testimonies. What else? Let's see. Oh man, yeah, some of the tribes they got the Mississippi Choctaw paid them almost $16 million for this. The Agua Caliente Band paid them more than $7 million. Yeah, just a huge amount of money. Now, Abramoff was convicted, but he got a relatively light federal sentence, which, you know, you'll get 20 years for like shoplifting, but you get 2 years for ripping off $80 million. What's really remarkable about this is that this gaming scandal occurred despite what was supposed to be more like oversight by the National Indian Gaming Commission. I mean, it seems like for some, federal trust relationship with the tribes is a license to exploit the tribes with very little punishment. There does seem to be kind of a double standard in federal adjudication in Indian country, with severe penalties doled out for corruption involving tribal leaders, while corrupt congressmen and federal personnel are very rarely charged at all. And when they are, you know, they go to like country club prisons. We've talked off and on throughout the semester about the effects of alcoholism on Native communities. We talked about that Gosh, I think starting back in the fourth lecture, and how that could be used sometimes to influence tribal leaders, and that substance abuse is still an issue in Native communities. Alcoholism is the number one killer among American Indians and Alaskan Natives between the ages of 15 and 44. Um, the reported rate of alcoholism in Native communities is about 300% higher than it is in the general population. And that is also associated with other health problems, including cirrhosis of the liver, suicide, homicide, accidents. And that, compare that with the leading causes of death in the general population, which is like heart disease and cancer. Um, and then, of course, you've got mental health issues that are associated with substance abuse. A part of the dilemma facing substance abuse is that many marginalized Native people suffer from the dilemma of being Indian and wanting to be Indian, but being disconnected from their traditional cultures. And that is a result of government policies going back to the reservation era, but really hardcore, um, cropping up during the relocation and termination era. We've got people who weren't allowed, um, to grow up near their traditional communities and learn their traditions. This is sometimes called Indian marginality. 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 And that's a term used to talk about the psychological ambiguity within some Native people who have difficulty walking into worlds. It's when an individual is a tribal member, but they weren't like adequately socialized within their traditional culture to know their language, to know their cultural heritage. And that's the result of numerous faulty programs forced upon Indian tribes by the federal government. In essence, it is the culmination of cultural genocide. While Indian self-determination has attempted to correct the effects of this, there's still a lot of residual effects in Indian country, and it often manifests as substance abuse and violence. And major consequences of this marginality are things like fetal alcohol syndrome and violence against women. For these individuals who are dealing with this marginality, um, who don't have a connection to their traditional cultures, pan-Indianism can offer a partial solution. It provides sort of a generic ethnic image, but it's one that can be shared by all of the 563 recognized tribes in the US, as well as among the First Nations of Canada. Um, Access to their traditional heritage isn't readily available, so it perpetuates people's feelings of marginality. But being a part of a pan-Indian movement can give people something, some kind of foundation to build on, even if it's not specifically Creek or Chippewa or whatever. People who don't have access to even that, though, they're living in a lot of frustration and kind of an ambiguous cultural situation. And that creates a situation where alcohol can provide an affordable method of escape from reality. And alcohol does have a greater effect on some Native people than it does on non-Native people. It's not because Native folks have like a genetic predisposition to be alcoholics. That's not true. People with a greater degree of Indian blood tend to have difficulty metabolizing sugar. In our traditional diets, sugar was mostly absent. Sugar cane didn't even grow here. And that difficulty metabolizing sugar also helps to explain the high rate of diabetes and hypertension and obesity among full-blood Native people. Um, and it's that difficulty metabolizing sugar that also makes some Native people more susceptible to alcohol, to intoxication. The problem of alcohol abuse has been recognized for a long time by tribal governments. In the 1980s, their efforts to get some kind of programming started resulted in the passage of the Indian Alcohol and Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which, that's too long, I'm not going to put that on the test. But what was not discussed in the 1980s when that act was passed, or what was not even really being studied, was the extent of fetal alcoholism among American Indians. And that's a phenomenon that transcends generations of victims. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a relatively new term. It doesn't show up in the medical literature anywhere until the early 1970s. Now it's in like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the standard for psychology and counseling and nursing and social work. Fetal alcohol syndrome can cause a whole array of problems, from low birth rate to heart defects, to behavioral problems, to small size relative to other children of their age, difficulty growing, problems with motor skills, sometimes seizures, and sometimes a degree of like learning disabilities. Now, collectively, those conditions can greatly impact a child's educational and behavioral and social functioning. Early research on the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome was conducted at the Boston University School of Medicine, where a major finding was the fact that the effect of alcohol on the fetus is not equal for all women. The really critical variables appear to be related to biocultural factors, including what your gestational stage is at the time of exposure to alcohol, and what is the mother's susceptibility to alcohol, what is the mother's general health and nutrition, and is she a chronic user of alcohol, or is she just drinking occasionally, and the prevalence of stress and anxiety in the mother's life. So the risk of having a child born with fetal alcohol syndrome is likely to increase when you add on each mediating factor. So a mother who has no difficulty metabolizing sugar, who's probably going to be European or African, that takes away one of these mediating factors. A mother who is in generally good health and has access to good nutrition, that takes away another mediating factor. A mother who is seeing her doctor regularly and is kind of, as low stress as you can be when you're pregnant, that takes away another mediating factor. So if she has a couple drinks late in her pregnancy, her child is almost certainly not going to have fetal alcohol syndrome. On the other hand, if you've got a mother who does have difficulty metabolizing sugar, if you've got a mother who does not have access to adequate health care, a mother who doesn't have access to decent nutrition, if you've got a pregnant mother who is under incredible stress and anxiety, and if you've got a mother who is already suffering from alcoholism and is drinking periodically throughout her pregnancy, then you've got really high risk for fetal alcohol syndrome. And across the board, the ethnic group that is most likely to have all 5 of those mediating factors present are Native mothers. The fetal alcohol syndrome problem in Indian country, that was discussed in congressional hearings held in the 1980s. Congress noted the high incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome first among the Plains tribes. The Aberdeen area had some of the highest fetal alcohol syndromes and substance abuse problems, not just among American Indians, but across the United States. The Aberdeen area covers North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. It's about 16 tribes in that region. And Indian Health Services established regional youth treatment centers to try and address the incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome and the related problems, health problems, learning problems, behavioral issues among children born with that. And across the country, 10 of those youth centers were established, including one down in Tahlequah. Now, obviously, the mental and physical health of Native women is a part of any fetal alcohol prevention program. Winnie Reed at the National Institute of Justice was instrumental in drawing attention to the living conditions of Native women in Indian country, particularly on reservations, as opposed to just tribal land. A committee met in 2001 and then again in 2012 to try and develop a way to address the structural factors that cause substance abuse problems and health issues among Native women. And one of the things that they've found is an underlying factor in all of those issues is violence against Indian women in Indian country. In 2013, Congress passed the Safety for Indian Women component of Title IX. The findings of the congressional probe relevant to that notes kind of the level of desperation for women in Indian country. Congress found in those investigations that 1 out of every 3 Native women are raped in their lifetimes. That 90% of their assailants are not tribal members. And that is a result of the confusion of jurisdiction and the inability of tribes to seek justice themselves for crimes perpetrated on their citizens. And I'll put a video in the modules for you to look at to kind of understand how this is happening. They also found that Native women experience 7 sexual assaults per 1,000 compared to 3 per 1,000 among Caucasian women. That Indian women experience the crime of battering at a rate of more than 23 per 1,000 compared with 8 per 1,000 among Caucasian women. They found that homicide was the 3rd leading cause of death of Indian women, girls and women aged 15 to 34. And for a period from the 80s into the early 90s, it was the 2nd leading cause of death of Indian girls aged 1 to 15. They found that Indian tribes don't have jurisdiction and don't have victim services resources to respond to violent assaults against women, and found that the legal relationship of the United States to the tribes creates a federal trust responsibility to assist tribal governments in safeguarding the lives of Native women. This is something that, we are still fussing with, still trying to solve, particularly the jurisdictional issue. Last fall, so less than a year ago, there was, Congress was going to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. One of the issues within that act that needed to be fixed was what happens in the state of Alaska. So Alaska has these 12 tribal corporations and also has other tribes that are not a part of these tribal corporations. The way that jurisdiction is set up is only federal officials can investigate violent crime perpetrated by non-native people on tribal land. So if a white person enters the land of one of these Alaska Native corporations and rapes somebody, the state can't do anything about it, the tribe can't do anything about it. It's the feds that have to do something about it. But Alaska is, first of all, frickin' huge. And second, doesn't have a lot of federal personnel. So there have been cases where an attack has happened on tribal land in Alaska, and the nearest federal personnel takes more than a day to get there, simply because there aren't enough personnel. And the distances that they have to cross to get to particularly remote locations is so onerous, by which time the perpetrator may have fled, or evidence may have been damaged, and very little is done about that attack. Very little is done to bring justice. And so in 2019, there was an attempt to fix that within the Violence Against Women Act. It didn't happen. The fix did not take place. So still dealing with this. On the other hand, I want to end on a happier note. So we're going to talk about tribal colleges and universities. We spent a lot of time talking about those damn boarding schools, and so things. We're going to talk about sort of the better side. Greater self-determination in Indian communities has allowed for much greater tribal input into the education of their children. Indian elementary and secondary schools began to flourish throughout Indian country with support from the National Indian Youth Council and the National Indian Education Association. And reservation community colleges began to be established in the 1960s and 1970s especially, to provide post-secondary education and training. The purpose for those colleges was to provide educational opportunities, especially for remote reservations, but also to ensure a tribal-specific culture for learning. Community colleges on big reservations, like the Navajo Reservation and the Sioux reservations, they often upgraded to become four-year colleges and universities. Some of them have graduate programs. Today, tribal colleges and universities service about 30,000 American Indian and Alaska Native students. There are 36 of them across the country. Now, in the public school system, there are still some problems. Those that are denoted as the Johnson-O'Malley schools, based on the Johnson-O'Malley Act that provided money for Native students in public schools. And those problems are the worst in areas where Native people have been demonized for a long time by settler descendants who forced them off their traditional land, like in Utah. A 2015 University of Utah study noted that Native students in Utah are 4 times more likely to get disciplinary action than their white counterparts, and 7.5 times more likely to be expelled. Also troubling are the cuts to Indian education in the current administration. The first Secretary of the Interior under Trump proposed a 12% cut across the board to the Bureau of Indian Education, and then an additional $23 million cut taken out of social services and welfare programs. That's the same person that allowed oil and mineral exploitation on Indian sacred land in the national park system. But to get back to the happier stuff, around here we've got some decent tribal colleges and universities. The College of the Muskogee Nation, it's a community college, developing a nice reputation for itself. There's Haskell Indian Nations University up in Lawrence, Kansas. I'll be honest, their reputation fluctuates. For a couple of decades, it'll be sort of the premier Indian college in the country, and then it'll kind of fall behind a little bit. Right now, it's kind of in an upswing, and it's a beautiful campus. There's also a really recent, we talked about this a little bit in our Zoom discussions, a really recent Supreme Court decision that may have an impact. So I think that's where we're going to end, talking about McGirt v. Oklahoma, the Supreme Court decision that just came out in July of 2020. So the situation behind this case, McGirt is Seminole. He's a member of the Seminole Nation. He committed a crime, a really heinous crime, on what was, according to treaties, Creek land, Muskogee Creek land. Since that treaty with the Creek Nation was signed, it was signed before Oklahoma was even a state. And when Oklahoma became a state, there were a number of programs and policies and laws at the federal level and at the state level that slowly siphoned off the vast majority of what that treaty had designated as Creek Reservation. And so when McGirt was found guilty in Oklahoma State Criminal Court, he challenged that decision. He said Oklahoma state courts shouldn't have jurisdiction. He said this was Creek land, it's been Creek land since the 1800s, and since he was himself a tribal citizen, a citizen of a different tribe, but still, it should have been the federal courts that tried him and not the state courts. And so that's the case that the Supreme Court heard. And the Supreme Court issued what we call a limited ruling with broad implications. So something I've been seeing on like Twitter and other forms of not very well informed social media is that the Supreme Court says Oklahoma has to give half of its land back to the Indians. That is not what the Supreme Court said. And first of all, how freaking insulting is that? It's specifically about the Muskogee Creek Nation, not about the Indians. So if land were going to be exchanging hands, which it's not, it would be with specifically the Muskogee Creek, not with like all native people in Oklahoma. But anyway, so the limited part of this ruling makes it specifically about law enforcement and jurisdiction. The Supreme Court held that that treaty that the United States signed with the Muskogee Creek way back in the 1800s, that treaty was never, Congress never officially undid that treaty. So it still stands. So in the area of law enforcement specifically, about half of Oklahoma, including a good chunk of Tulsa, falls under the Major Crimes Act, which was passed by Congress back in the late 1800s to deal with law enforcement and jurisdiction on reservations and tribal land. And so in the McGirt decision, the Supreme Court says if a member of an Indian tribe commits a crime on what is now defined as Creek land, then the federal government has to handle prosecution of that crime. It is not in the hands of the state. Now, for McGirt himself, it's not going to have a huge impact. He is going to be retried in federal. He is most likely going to be retried in federal court. The federal court will almost certainly find him guilty and sentence him to prison as well. So it's probably not going to have an impact on his life, which is fine. That the Creek Nation doesn't actually want him out of jail. It was a heinous crime. What we are likely to see in the aftermath of this is the Creek Nation negotiating with the state of Oklahoma for housing accused criminals as they await trial in now federal court. Because there are going to be, probably not a lot, but a dozen or so people who were accused of committing crimes in what is now defined as Creek territory, who are members of some tribe, and who are now going to have to be tried in federal court rather than state court. So the Muskogee Creek Nation is going to need to negotiate how that changeover is going to be handled. So that's the limited ruling part. The broad implications part is where it gets a little stickier. So the Supreme Court's ruling is solely about law enforcement. But because it does acknowledge that that treaty stands, it opens the door for Creek citizens to, well, one thing that we are expecting to see, probably not real soon, but maybe in the next few years, one thing that we are expecting to see is citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation who own businesses refusing to pay Oklahoma state sales tax. Because if they're Creek Nation citizens and they own a business on what is now defined as Creek Nation land, then they should not have to pay state sales tax. That is likely to provoke the state of Oklahoma to file suit against them. It's going to go back and forth. They will probably end up in the Supreme Court, and the Muskogee Creek Nation will probably file an amicus brief in support of its citizens. Now, the end result of this is likely to be the Muskogee Creek Nation themselves setting up their own sales tax program, which they've never had before. And if they're able to do that, if it works its way through the court system the way that we think it will, and again, this is something we don't expect to see this process even start for a couple of years. And once it starts, it will take probably a good decade at least to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. If this works out the way that we expect it to, and the Creek are able to set up their own sales tax scheme, that will provide a tremendous amount of revenue for the Creek Nation to then put into health and education and college scholarships and all of these, building up the College of the Muskogee Nation even more than it is, really having an impact on tribal citizens, and then also on non-tribal citizens who are a part of those families, or who live in what is now defined as Muskogee territory. As that builds up and gets more economic development, which is what we think is going to happen, that's going to bring a positive impact to everybody there. What we don't think will ever happen is an actual exchange of land. We think it's solely going to be within the realm of bureaucratic issues, really. Law enforcement, taxation, things like that. So that is a change that Indian country is really excited about, or this is a decision that Indian country is really excited about because of the potential impact that it could have. And then, of course, there's the question of other tribes with treaties. I'm thinking particularly of the Great Sioux Nation, with treaties that were never voided by Congress, who they will have to wait for a situation like this to come up, but they may be able to piggyback on this decision. So again, limited ruling, broad implications, but we're probably not going to see the broadness part of it play out for, even start to play out for at least a couple of years. So really that brings us to the end of this semester, kind of talking in detail about some of these 21st century issues. So, yeah, if you've got any questions about the final exam, don't forget to ask that and be prepared for that. All right, have a great rest of your term.